So deaths of despair. So I took on this topic before the current pandemic, and while it now seems more timely than ever, I'll be talking about this term in a general way, in a way that I hope will help you think about it in the current context. And none of what I say today represents SAMHSA's views, opinions, or policies. So before I say anything else, I want each of you to fill in this blank slide for yourselves. So I'll ask some questions and I'd really like you to just think about the answers. When you hear the phrase deaths of despair, what comes to mind? So what deaths do you think of? Who do you picture and where do you picture? What solutions come to mind and how optimistic do you feel about them? And how would you feel about your community being described as one that has a lot of deaths of despair? So I started this way to illustrate that our brains are meaning-making machines. And I think that's what got me interested in exploring this concept. How might it help us make meaning in suicide prevention, and how might it get in the way? So where did this start? So in 2015, Case and Deaton, who are economists at Princeton, noticed something very unusual about mortality rates. So after decades of consistent declines in mortality from all causes, this trend reversed in 1999 among white Americans aged 45 to 54. So the red line shows this. Mortality stopped declining and actually increased for this group. And the other lines show that other wealthy countries didn't see this reversal. So Case and Deaton identified 3 causes of death driving this trend: deaths from drugs, from alcohol, and from suicide. So this shows the trends for all 3 components. This is for all ages combined. And you can see suicide is in blue, drugs in green. And when you add all 3 together, you get that gray line, and you see that dramatic uptick just before 2000. So Case and Deaton first published these trends in 2015, but it wasn't until 2017 in a follow-up paper that they used the term deaths of despair as sort of a collective term for these causes of death. Their analysis did include men and women and demonstrate increases in both men and women, but rates for men are higher, and so that's gotten a lot of press attention. In terms of geographic, higher in rural areas, but not only rural areas. So initially also high in small to medium metro areas, and now even those geographic profiles are expanding. So the mortality increases from these 3 causes is especially dramatic for adults in midlife without a college degree. So this shows whites, but a similar education gap exists for Blacks in midlife. So in addition to mortality, they also found more morbidity or illness in this population. So worse health, mental health, higher pain, and isolation, impairment in daily activities, inability to work. So that's sort of deaths of despair in a nutshell. What about why it's happening? So Case and Deaton explored this question. They looked at similar trends in population level factors, economic, cultural, and social factors. And so they attribute increases in deaths of despair not to kind of a one point in time, something that happened at one point in time, or just sort of all at once, but they describe it as a long-standing process of disadvantage that's cumulative. At the root is declining job prospects for individuals with less education, fewer well-paid stable jobs. That means lost income and resources, but also the structure, meaning, and social context that work can bring. Those labor trends coincide with less marriage, more cohabitation, and parenting outside marriage, so fewer stable social ties, less community engagement like religious participation. So these sort of are all trending in similar ways. So deaths of despair is sort of the classic sticky idea, right? It's attention getting, it sticks with you when you hear it. And because it's gotten so much attention, it's worth thinking about whether this concept is helpful to the suicide prevention field. I want to be clear that what I'm talking about today is the concept of deaths of despair and whether or not we use it to kind of frame the issue of suicide. What I'm not talking about is whether or not people should use the word despair, and especially with regard to describing their own lived experience or other people's lived experience. So it's really the concept that we're focusing on. So I want to apply two lenses to this discussion. One is from Dr. Nicole Bowman, who's an Indigenous evaluator. She shared a poem with me that poses some wonderful equity questions. So when looking at any research or body of knowledge, we're always thinking about who is heard or who is represented, but Nicole says we need to also think about who is voiceless or silenced. We're going to ask, well, what does this focus on? But we also have to be asking what is not included. What designs and methods are used? What is not used? So this is only part of it, and you can sort of unpack the whole knowledge generation process in this way. But I really appreciate Dr. Bowman's willingness to share this and to allow me to use it. The other lens I want to bring today is around framing. So the Berkeley Media Studies Group talks about the concept of framing with regard to public health. So in general, we all approach new information with pre-existing ideas in our heads about how the world works. And so frames help us process that information by helping us identify patterns, distilling meanings. Very often they trigger emotions or associations, certain kinds of values, judgments, causal explanations. So I love this quote: they create tracks for a train of thought, and once on that track, it's hard to get off. So the media plays a role in creating and reinforcing frames, but so do we. So here's an example of a frame, just an example of a frame that's not about what we're talking about today, but in our field historically, there was sort of this frame of it's mostly mental illness that causes suicide. So that puts some people, some causes, some solutions inside the frame, but we also know it leaves some other things outside the frame. So that's just an example of how a frame can operate. And the question I want us to consider today is, what is inside the frame when we think about deaths of despair, and what is left outside that frame? So I did some thinking about how might this concept help us in our field. And these are some ways that I brainstormed. First of all, it might increase public attention to suicide, right? So, any opportunity for suicide to get more airtime is a good thing. It highlights middle-aged individuals, and especially some of the media attention has focused on men. And we know that adults in midlife, and especially men, are a group with very high rates of suicide. And that's sort of a positive development because people in this age group have been less of a focus than youth, for example. It has the potential to highlight links between substance misuse and suicide. So that might lead us to more collaboration, more shared solutions. It brings very much needed attention to the potential role of larger social and economic forces. So that's kind of a positive equity implications, because it's bringing us, expanding us to think about underlying social influences, not just individual pathology. Sometimes deaths of despair can be really a good jumping off point for a focus on upstream prevention, but I've also seen it very much as a jumping off point for downstream. I haven't seen others talk about this, but I kind of have wondered if the idea of despair might have the potential to sort of humanize people who think about suicide, kind of similar to talking about suicide as a response to immense pain, because that counters other wrong-minded beliefs like suicide is selfish. So how might the deaths of despair concept be problematic for us? And here's sort of 4 categories. It might actually reduce attention to suicide. It can oversimplify mortality, obscure inequalities, and oversimplify causes. So let me show you some examples of these. So this is the graph I showed earlier. The green line, the increases in drug deaths are more recent and steeper and now go higher than the suicide line. And so that kind of pulls people's attention, and you end up with the kind of take home like the one shown here. Drug overdose deaths drove the increase. In terms of how it oversimplifies mortality, some argue that we really shouldn't treat deaths of despair as one monolith because there's so much variability across the 3 causes. So patterns vary by state, different trends over time, different patterns across demographic groups. So what's an example of that? This shows variability across states. Lighter shading is lower rates and darker shading is higher rates. So on the right, you see overdoses, and you see New England, Mid-Atlantic have been particularly hard hit by the opioid epidemic in particular. Western states, that's a different pattern than Western states, where Western states had higher rates of death from suicide and alcohol. Again, not identical trends, but more similar than to drug overdose. And you can see the variability if you look at individual states. So Pennsylvania, suicide rates are in the middle range, alcohol deaths are low, and drug deaths are high. Oregon, where we're supposed to be, suicide rates again are in the middle, but it's switched. Alcohol deaths are high, overdoses are low. And finally, Arkansas, suicide rates are high, alcohol deaths low, and overdoses in the middle. So if we just talk about one monolithic idea, we're going to miss some of this variability. In some ways, it obscures longstanding and current inequalities, and therefore has the potential to reinforce them. So Comro said, well, these deaths have long been endemic among American Indian and Alaska Native populations, and people haven't really paid that much attention to it. So, that there's sort of an equity conversation to be had there of now the focus is on white adults in middle age, and that's getting attention. In fact, American Indian and Alaska Native populations, many charts that I see don't actually break them out as a separate group. So a lot of times they're just missing from the discussion. Also missing groups at risk that aren't identified by demographics, like veterans, LGBTQ individuals, attempt survivors. Missing are trends in other demographics, other explanations besides the kind of labor market social capital explanations, and also a strengths or assets frame. So I'll just show you an example of the populations. This is just suicide, and this is the percent change in rates from 2008 to 2017. And so although we know that males have much higher rates, the rate of increase is actually higher among females, higher among Black and Latino populations, higher among younger ages. And while the rates of increase are highest in rural areas, there's pretty steep increases in metro as well. So while it's critical for us to pay attention to what's happening among less educated white men and women in midlife, it's important to ask what other groups have increasing rates and why. And why is the rate of increase lower in some groups that have faced similar economic and societal challenges? A number of scholars have raised good questions about causation. So we have this catchy term, but we haven't validated the claim that deaths of despair is a common pathway to these three types of death. So Geronimus and colleagues said, well, okay, if we think about despair as its definition, the complete loss or absence of hope, it's kind of credible that suicide reflects the absence of hope, but is despair really the key explanation for chronic liver disease or overdose deaths? And Shanahan and colleagues posed the question, does despair really kill? And said, this is more than a kind of catchy phrase, it actually is a hypothesis. And so if we want to pursue that hypothesis, what we can do is really map it out. What are the elements along the kind of causal logic model, and let's study them over time. And not just at the individual level, but also at kind of in a multi-level way. So deaths of despair puts despair in the center of the frame as the main cause, and equity questions ask what causes are left out. So how does it change our thinking if we do a thought experiment and put other causes at the center? So what if instead of deaths of despair, we said deaths of deceitful marketing? What about deaths of alcohol availability, deaths of disconnection, deaths of inaccessible care, deaths of system fragmentation, deaths of oppression or racism, deaths of economic insecurity? So frames are sort of about more than words, but different words do cause us to kind of change our frames. So what? So where am I, what's the bottom line with all this? For me, after having done all this background reading, the bottom line is this. People outside the suicide prevention field created the deaths of despair concept for their own research purposes. And it's really kind of by default become a frame for our work. So the question is, should we use it ourselves? I think everyone has to decide that for themselves, weigh these pros and cons. As a research-informed field, we should educate ourselves about what the concept is and isn't, and be thoughtful about it. And I love this quote from George Lakoff: "Unless you frame yourself, others will frame you." So if we're going to frame the issues for ourselves, my recommendation is to start with your end in mind. So for each of you, you may have a different frame around your work. What's your mission? How are you working to advance suicide prevention? Who are your audiences and what action steps are you promoting? And then we can ask, what framing will resonate? What framing is consonant with that? We want to engage people with lived experience and people in the community to help answer that question. So deaths of despair might be a mismatch with what you're trying to accomplish. On the other hand, there may be people in your community who really are concerned about deaths of despair, and it's a way to get them connected with suicide prevention. I think people have to think that through. Oh, sorry. So even if you don't choose to use it, the phrase is out there and it's in use. So my recommendation around that is that we should all kind of have our own messaging ready and be ready to pivot from that deaths of despair discussion to suicide prevention. So is someone else's interest in deaths of despair an opportunity for me to put something in front of them that I think is important? Should part of my response include pushing back on the narrative of deaths of despair? And I would say, for me, this is really key. How do I use the opportunity to share a positive vision of what I'm working towards? So when I started, the questions I started out with is deaths of despair helpful to our field and should we use it? And I'd like to leave you with what I now think is a better question, which is, what's your frame? And thank you.